Good afternoon. I'm Ross Hudson. I'm from Area 2. I'm the social work director, and I'm here today to talk to you about working with your teen patients that come into the local health departments in regard to family planning and EPSDT. First, we want to look at the services provided to all family planning teens that come in. You want to assess their knowledge of birth control, and you may find that there's a lot of myths out there in regard to what they consider really how to tell if they're pregnant or not, so you may run into that. Their knowledge about STD and HIV. You want to explain care coordination services, including the requirement for quarterly contact, either the phone or face-to-face. You want to provide care coordination services if the teen agrees to the quarterly contact. You want to close the case and use an activity type 7 if the teen cannot agree to the quarterly contact. In looking at non-family planning teens that come into the health department referred for the routine screening, this is where you use the EPSDT care coordination screening worksheet for those teens. If you find that there are needs identified, you want to offer care coordination, and you may use the CHR 17 worksheet for teens who are not sexually active and have no identified high-risk behaviors. You always want to use the teen psychosocial assessment worksheet for sexually active teens or teens involved in the high-risk behaviors. For those teenagers that choose not to participate in the programs you need to, or they have no needs identified, you want to go ahead and close the case using activity type 7. In working with teenagers, and I've been doing that for about 25 years now, you really have to start where they are. You've got to connect with them, and that means being open to them, about them talking about their cars, their sex life, their parents, their friends, those kind of things, and that's really important. And if you think about the teens that come into the health department, they're there to get birth control information or to get started on birth control. So, and looking at teens that come in with the highest risk for pregnancy, you look at some of the characteristics for those are those that invest less effort in school, do more poorly in school, have lower expectations for the future, more likely to use alcohol and drugs excessively, more likely to engage in unconventional and unhealthy behaviors. So these are some of the characteristics that some of our teenagers have that come into the health department. Teens with the highest risk for pregnancy are those that experience sexual pressure or even abuse. They have begun dating when they are very young. If female, have a relationship with an older male, or were often more aggressive and less well-liked in elementary school. As we developed the teen program and thought about working with teens in the EPSDT program, we realized that we needed another worksheet to address those special needs of a teenager, and so we came up with this. A group of social workers came up with this in the health department, and we realized that when you really need a lead-in when you talk to teenagers, and one of the things that they feel very comfortable talking to a stranger about is their school. And so what we did was we started off with the school questions first. And it's really important to connect with them when they first come in. And so we ask, are you in school? And then we, usually in that we'll ask, well, what school are you going to? What grade are you in? Do you like school? And that helps us give us some insight into how well they're doing in school and other factors going on in their life. We look at it if they've completed school, and we ask what grade they're in, what subjects they like, and achieving according to potential. What we really are looking at is not, you don't ask them, are you achieving according to potential? You're looking at their grade level, and asking them, well, what kind of grades are you making? Are you making A's, B's, C's, D's, and what's normal for them? And then that kind of lets us know if something's going on. If they've always made A's and suddenly they're making C's and D's, then there may be other problems going on, either being involved with somebody, or there could be some drug use or other things that could clue you in when you're working with them. You want to look at the risk for expulsion or a dropping out or truancy, and one way you get at that is by asking about the number of days. How many days have you missed of school this year? And if they say, hey, I've already missed 100 days and it's only 2 months into the year, you already know there's some problems. So you want to ask that. The motivation to improve performance, what we're looking at is really what kind of things do they like at school? Is there a certain subject they like? Is there a teacher they like? And so is there someone working at the school? Sometimes it can be the school bus driver, the cafeteria worker. So you kind of want to look and see what kind of things they like at school and what can motivate them. The next part on the worksheet is the whole issue of peers. And teenagers are greatly influenced by their peer group. And so I usually ask them, well, do you have a lot of friends? And sometimes they'll say, well, I don't have any friends, but I have a lot of acquaintances. And so we talk some about that, how they identify a friend, what a friend does for them, what they view as a good characteristic of a friend. And then we move into, on here we say negative peer group, but what we're looking at is, well, I'll say, well, why do you like to hang around with those friends? And they'll say, well, we go down and we bust out some windows at the local store. Or, hey, I enjoy hanging with these friends because there's an elderly person in the neighborhood and we go together and we go mow their grass, or we take them some food by, or those kinds of things. We go talk to that elderly person. So it kind of gives me a gauge on really, are they really hanging with, a negative peer group or a positive peer group? It gives me some information on that. And then the next part is we're looking back at their dating information. We try to find out some about that. The next section is environmental factors, and what we're looking at is sometimes teens get reported to us about things going on and the teacher doesn't know what's going on. And so I may ask, well, what's happening at home? And they'll say, Mom and Dad got in a fight, there's not enough money, our water got cut off. And you may get a report from one of the school teachers saying, Johnny's stinking, or Mary's got some bad breath. And what you find out is that the utilities have been cut off and there's, they don't have any running water, no hot water, so that lets you know that. The adequate housing, I usually ask them, do you have to share a bedroom? Do you have your own bedroom? And it's always surprising to me how many teenagers sleep out on a couch. And so, that lets me have an idea of what's going on in that family. Is there adequate bedrooms for everyone? Is the house adequate? Reliable transportation. If they've come in late to their appointment, I may ask them if they're having problems with transportation. In a lot of families in the rural part of our state, there may only be one car in the family, and so everybody's having to use that car for transportation, so there could be some real problems there. They could be depending on their peer group for transportation, or an older brother and older sister to do that, so there could be some real problems there. Adequate food. I usually don't ask, do you have adequate food in your refrigerator? I may say, what do you like to eat? Is there any favorite meal that you enjoy eating at home? And they may say, well, we always order, takeout, or we run by McDonald's and pick up something. So that lets me have an idea of what's really going on in the home in regard to the food. Adequate income. I can usually get more information about that in regard to looking, at their clothes, talking to them about, are they able to afford the clothes they would like to buy. Other things in regard to, if they want to buy a computer, or do they have a computer, do they have the radios, do they have the tennis shoes, do they have the things that most teenagers want to have. And so that lets me have an idea of really what's going on in that home in regard to the income. Public benefits, health insurance. What I usually go by is really, is there any kind of assistance coming into the home? And sometimes they may say that there's food stamps or there's some type of HUD allowance for the housing, and so that lets me know what's going on there in that category. The next section of the worksheet is family factors. I want to know, does that teenager live in a supportive environment? And I'm not going to ask you, the teenager, do you live in a supportive environment? I'm going to ask, well, who do you talk to when you have problems? Is there a family member, a friend in that community, someone in your church that you talk with? And so I try to find out more about what supports are there for that teenager. Are the family aware of the patient's sexual activity? And a lot of times in assessment, if you have the parents in there, it's going to be a different answer than it is when the parents are out of the room. And so in a lot of situations, families know about their child participating in sexual activity. They just don't know to the extent that they are. It's always amazing some of the stories that we have when they come in. I was working with one teenage girl, and her dad had caught her with her boyfriend, and he was really concerned about that and wanted her on birth control. But during the assessment, he found out, or I had found out, that she had actually had 4 sexual partners in the last week, and only one of those was her boyfriend. And so, of course, father didn't know that. So in most situations, the family has a little idea, but they don't know the full extent of the sexual activity. You want to know if there's a family history of teen birth. In a lot of families, what we have found out, if the mother had a child in early teens, then that history will be repeated, either with an older sibling or with this teenager. And so we kind of want to have an idea of what's been going on there. If mother gave birth to them at 13, then there may be really issues around parenting and other issues that may come up later. We want to look at stressful life events, marriage and divorce, and how this worksheet is divided up. We have the yes and no on one side, and then we have the self and family on the other, knowing that we have several teens that have been married and already divorced. They may have been married and divorced twice by the time they're 15. But, you know, that's an issue. Then, you know, sometimes getting into, and they will talk about it if you ask them, well, you know, tell me something about your mom and dad. How many times have they been married? And they'll come in and they'll tell you 4 or 5 times, or, you know, can really give you some good family history there. And issues around divorce. And what we find out now is that a lot of families, people live together, but they're not married. So those are issues that come out. We want to know about death of a significant other, because this can affect their behavior. If they've had peers that have hurt themselves or killed themselves, that can really make a difference. If they've had a grandparent that passed, or a parent that passed, or an older brother or sister that was killed, it can really make a difference in how they're dealing with the stress of life each day. Then the next area we get into is, of course, arrest and charges. And with teenagers, what you find out, if you ask them, have you been arrested, they will say no. But what you'll find out is that they may have been charged with numerous things, you know, but they just were never convicted. So you want to be very clear when you talk to them about arrest and charges, and really get their interpretation, and really, you know, have you been charged with anything? And so the story may be very different according to how you ask the question. Also, you find out, or we have found out, that a lot of our families, our teenagers, come from families where both mom and dad are in prison or have been had trouble with the law. So that can be a real significant issue. In dealing with teens that have histories of delinquency, there are some indicators of serious problems. 80% of teens admit to having engaged in delinquent acts. And these could be just the normal kinds of things of busting out windows, going too fast, skipping school, playing pranks in the neighborhood. Those kinds of things are, you know, it's very normal for teenagers. And then there's another group and when normal teenagers get into trouble, they usually stop that behavior. But then there's another group of troubled adolescents that continue to act out even though the consequences are pretty severe. They just keep on repeating those types of behaviors. In some serious delinquent behavior, it's the #1 predictor of poverty. Oftentimes some of the characteristics are that the parents are not available to the teen. Usually the parents are off working. Mom and dad may both be working, and so there's no one in the home to do any supervision. Often you find that they've experienced serious physical, emotional abuse or neglect. Sometimes children who are continuously abused cope by eventually identifying with the abuser. And so we see that quite often where a son sees his mom abused and he comes back and he ends up hitting his girlfriend or having those issues too. Sometimes with the serious delinquent behavior, there's a deep-seated feeling of no future, and with 9/11, that's even reinforced that more. There's kind of a hopelessness out there. There is no reason to do anything any better. In their neighborhood, they know people that have been killed or shot for selling drugs, so they feel like they have to really take all of life in by the age of 21. So you may run across that. And then the antisocial acts gain peer acceptance or getting into gangs, and this is where you find out they may do things not because they really want to do it, but they just want to be accepted by their peer group. Okay, going back to the worksheet in stressful life events, we look at there could be issues of homelessness, and this is where I had a case once of where a teenager came in and the teacher was really concerned because he was not getting his homework, his appearance was really dirty, he seemed to have lost weight, and what we found out is that he was living in a car. Both his mom and dad had kicked him out, his parents were divorced, and they felt like they couldn't manage him. And since he was over the age of 16, they just both kicked him out of their house. And so he was living in a car. And of course, that's how he came to our attention. So you may run into things like that. And so it's not just being teenagers being non-compliant with different things or wanting to make a spectacle of themselves. It just may be some simple thing that, hey, they don't have anywhere to live or any place to sleep that night. Okay, in the next section, it's dealing with emotional and mental health issues, and this is where we really get into the history of psychiatric problems. And we're not going to ask, hey, are you crazy? Is your mama crazy? You may get a clue when you go out in the waiting room and they're screaming and fighting with each other that there may be some family dynamics there that need some work. But really, going back to saying, well, have you ever been to counseling, or has any family member ever been to counseling, can give you some history into that. And usually they may say, hey, my mom's depressed, or my mom's on some antipsychotic medication or whatever. And so that can give you some history there in regard to what's going on in the family. And then we want to look at depressive symptoms and really getting into what some of those are. Do they have them or not, or, does the family members have them? And if you think about what are some of the symptoms of depression, some of them are persistent sad or irritable mood, loss of interest in enjoyed activities, significant appetite, body weight changes, difficulty sleeping or oversleeping, psychomotor agitation or retardation, loss of energy, difficulty concentrating, feelings of worthlessness, guilt, recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. And then some specific symptoms of adolescent depression are vague physical complaints, school absences or poor performance, runaway thoughts or behaviors, outbursts, crying, shouting, whining, boredom, loss of interest in friends and activities, social isolation, and poor communication. Now, I think most teenagers have some symptoms of depression, and you may think that's just normal adolescent behavior, and to a degree it is. It's just when it really begins to get extreme that, we need to address what those things are. And the next piece of the emotional mental health part of the assessment is the suicidal risk, and what we really want to do is really look at what's going on with that teenager. You want to ask, are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? And it goes back to, in the initial part of the assessment, we talk about what's confidential and what's not confidential, and I make it real clear that if they talk about having suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation, that is something that I've got to report. And sometimes teenagers are very afraid about talking about having those feelings, and so I make those very normal, that they, it's all right to have those feelings, we need to talk about that, and then, we make appropriate referrals where we need to. Some of the things in regard to suicide risk are, depression increases risk of suicidal behavior. With boys, risk increases, with depression, with chemical dependence, alcohol and substance abuse. Suicide is the third leading cause of death in 10 to 24-year-olds, according to information from 1997. With suicide risk, some of the signs of trouble are change from the usual changes in their behavior, eating, either they're eating too much or they stop eating. Usually teenagers eat a lot, so it's usually when they stop eating that there may be some problems. Sleeping for a normal teenager may be 10, 12 hours, so suddenly if they're only sleeping 2 or 3 hours a night, that may be an indicator. Sudden mood swings, this is where constantly there's this yelling 1 minute, then crying the next minute, threatening the next minute. Dressing, this is where you can see some of where usually a teenager may have always wanted to fit in and dress the row of his peers or her peers, and suddenly they may be dressing all in black or change their hair, shave their head, some of those kinds of things where they're drawing attention to themselves. Grades in school, you may have a teenager who typically makes A's and B's and suddenly it falls off to where they're making D's and F's. So you may see a really drop in grades. And then acts of hostility and aggression. This is where some teenagers get upset. That's just a normal thing. But this is where they begin to really act out, threatening their teachers, their peers, their siblings, their parents. So that could be a real sign of they're not just being, a bad teenager. They may actually have some issues around suicide. Also, having passive behavior. So this is where they're just giving in, and a lot of times how it comes out is I've talked to girls who have agreed to have multiple sex partners, and part of it is that they are just giving in. They don't care about living, and so they just give in. Alcohol and drug abuse. So this is where they may just try numerous drugs and all kinds of alcohol, really trying to kill themselves. Loss of friends, where teenagers may change, of where they've always had some friends and suddenly nobody wants to hang with them. Nobody wants to be around them because they're so unpredictable. They're scared to ride in the car with them, afraid they're going to run into some embankment or something like that. So you can see friends pulling away from them. History of family member committing suicide. This is a real big factor in looking at suicidal risk, and what we have found out that in numerous cases either a mother or father, an older sibling or grandparent had committed suicide, so there's a real risk there for that. The main thing when you talk to a teenager about suicide is just recognizing, making it normal, where they realize that we all have feelings of suicide. If you live in today's world, there's all kinds of issues that come out that you have to face, and it's very normal to have those thoughts, but it's on how much you dwell on those thoughts can, really be an indicator of really how serious the problem is. You want to take all suicide threats seriously. You just want to, evaluate them and say, oh, well, they talked about killing themselves, but I don't think they really meant it. And sometimes when you talk to the parents, they may have said, well, Johnny or Susie, they've always threatened to kill themselves. And so, we have to let them know as care coordinators, if they mention that they are thinking about hurting themselves, then we will take that seriously. You want to encourage teens to talk to someone who can help them get an evaluation and treatment, and that may be really hard. And sometimes they have used me in this type of situation to tell their parents, hey, I really do have some feelings, I need some help. Ross, can you get me some help? And so you really want to take that seriously when they open up to you about that issue. What may come out also are some eating disorders when you do this part of the teen psychosocial assessment, and finding out that what's been going on with that teen. And, teens are very self-conscious about their body and how they look according to fashion. It used to be just mainly a female issue, but lately there's a lot of pressure on the males out there to look a certain way, to have the six-pack abs, and girls to look a certain way. And so there's some real issues around that. And so what you may find out is when you talk to teenagers that they say, no, I don't have that problem, but I have friends that do. And what we have found out are that some teenagers all go together and they'll eat a meal and then go all to the bathroom together and throw it up, those kinds of things. So, as they talk about their friends, you may get some indicator of what's going on there. And there's different types of eating disorders, from the anorexia to the bulimia to the compulsive overeating. And so I always joke that I'm a bulimic that doesn't throw up. So there's all kinds of issues around eating and control, and so you really want to watch about ignoring those kinds of behaviors. You really want to get at, if they feel like they're overweight and you're looking at a 90-pound person and they feel like they're fat, then, that may be a real issue, and you want to acknowledge that and get them some help around that issue. The next part, the mental health part of this assessment, is the making an evaluation on alcohol, drug, and tobacco use. And so what you get into a lot of times are that teenagers are trying all kinds of things. There's all kinds of drugs out there, and they may get hung up on telling you the 15 types of drugs that they've tried or all the alcohol they've tried, those kinds of things. But really getting into, when does it cross the line from use to abuse? Are they using every day? How many times a day? That's what concerns me. It's pretty normal for teenagers. It's rare to find a teenager that hasn't experimented some with alcohol or drugs, but really getting at how much they're using, how it's affecting their life. Have they seen a drop in grades? Does it improve their mood, or do they find themselves irritable? So I look at those kinds of things that may indicate, there's a real problem there. And of course you want to address what's going on in the family, and what you find out, it depends, what's been very normal for that family. If mom and dad are alcoholics, then, there can be some real concerns there about their son and daughter growing up and being an alcoholic. So you really want to look at that. With adolescents, there's the normal experimentation. Try it, and that's very normal. They do it. It's when there's a problem, and it's when they begin to organize their lives around getting or using the substance. And this is where sometimes you find teenagers that sell their body or begin to steal. They break into their parents' home. They do those kinds of things to get money to buy the drugs. And then where they have to have multiple drinks or hits to begin to feel high. One or two drinks initially may have been all it took, but now they're having to drink a six-pack before they get the buzz. So that gives you an indicator of how much they're using. Okay, in the next part of the assessment, we get at looking at reasons that youth initiate sexual activity. I think most teenagers are, they want to try it. They've heard a lot about it all their life. And if you think about society and media now, how it's geared towards the sexual needs or sexual issues, it gets reinforced. So they want to do it. They're curious about it. Everybody's talking about it. To feel loved, to keep a boyfriend or girlfriend, sometimes both, to become pregnant, to improve manhood, peer pressure. There's just many different reasons that they may begin to initiate the sexual activity. And when you talk to them about sexual activity, it can be a real tricky issue. You want to find out, what they consider sexual activity. Some have the Bill Clinton definition of what is sex. And so, I usually ask them, what do you consider sex? And so it's really amazing the answers that I hear. And I get into, do they have multiple partners? Are they monogamous? And sometimes what you find out is that they are monogamous for today. They may have had 5 partners that week, but they were monogamous with each one. Sometimes they may, well, are you talking about all at one time? when you talk about multiple partners, are you talking about one at a time, or are you talking about several? So don't be surprised when the teenager comes up and said, oh, well, I was out with my friend and then I had sex with his 3 friends also, So there may be issues around that. You want to know about their history of using birth control. Are they using it? That's really important. Then there's history of rape, incest, or domestic violence. Is there a history there? And sometimes, those are some of the issues that we talk about. We want to know. And sometimes it's really amazing. They may come in, and because you're talking about these issues and they feel some trust there, then they come out and start talking about these different types of things. And so be prepared for that. Then there's the self-reported concerns, the HIV and AIDS, and a lot of the teenagers have the basic information about HIV and AIDS, and most have been brought up since the 80s, having some knowledge from preschool, elementary school about HIV AIDS. And so some may say, well, I'm not gay, so there's no way I can catch that. And so sometimes you really have to deal with a myth there about dating and about HIV AIDS. STDs, finding out, do they know about that? And it's amazing some of the myths that are out there, how they feel like they can tell if someone has an STD or not. And so you want to find out really what they feel about STDs and, just their basic knowledge of that. And then you want to know, is there a history of pregnancy, miscarriage, abortion? And it's surprising sometimes about how many teenagers have had miscarriages or have had a pregnancy and then lost the baby. So you can never just assume that when you bring in a 14-year-old that you never know what you're going to deal with. So you have to be open and ready to hear what they're going to say in regard to that. The next section is maternal history. You want to know, has the child or children have child care provided by another, if they have had a child. And so, is there an older brother or sister taking care of the child or another family member? Is there any issues around the child or children being removed due to abuse or neglect? And are there needs for parenting skills? A lot of young teenage parents have needs, and so there needs to be some skills taught, and so it's really good if you work with your local DHR or other agency to identify some sites where they can go and get some parenting skills. And you want to look at the birth control method used at the time of conception, because obviously it didn't work. Either they weren't consistent in taking it or using the condom each time. So you really want to look at that and see what was going on when that child was conceived. And in the final part of the assessment, we really are just kind of generalizing, looking back at the teenager. You want to find out, are they assertive? But through all their answers that they've given you through the assessment process, you can really tell, are they speaking up for themselves? Are they always reflecting back what their peers have said or their parents have said? And will they speak up? Making decisions easily, through the assessment process, you can kind of tell, well, what's been going on with them? Are they able to, do they clearly think out all the options and then decide, or do they just make a quick decision? Do they get along well with authority figures? From the very first part of the assessment, where they talked about, getting along with school officials or not, they can let you, know that. If they're talking about how bad their mom is or their dad or other family members, that can give you some, some insight into those issues also. And then the positive image of self. Really a lot of teenagers have issues about self-esteem, and really, where are they when they look at themselves? And I get at that by them describing to me, themselves, and not just the physical outside, but really who they are as a teenager, what they like, what they have, hopes for, what their dreams are, and so that kind of gives me an idea of some ways to motivate them. I'll look at their special interests, skills, and abilities. It helps me pull together a true picture of the teenager and what's going on in their life, their hopes and their dreams, and so it helps me pull that picture all together. It's really difficult working with teenagers, and I wish you luck in doing that. It takes a special person to work with teenagers. So that's all I have. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. If not, you can talk to your local social work director and they can answer any questions you may have regarding working with your teen patients. Thank you.